Welcome to the Thoughtful Leader podcast. My name is Ben Brearley. I'm a leadership coach and the founder of Thoughtful Leader. The Thoughtful Leader podcast is all about short, sharp leadership advice because thoughtful leadership is good leadership. Welcome to episode 329 of the Thoughtful Leader podcast. In this episode, I'm going to talk about how much empathy you should have based on a question that was asked to me in a training course last week. So let's get into this episode right now. Now, it's an interesting question that was posed to me last week in a training session where someone asked me, how much empathy should I have for my team or, my employees? And I thought it was an interesting question. And at the time, I jokingly remarked that 37% empathy is how much you should have. Hence the title of this episode. Now, the reality is, I think, as we know, empathy is something where you can term it as putting yourself in other people's shoes or trying to think from another person's perspective. So empathy is not about having had the same experiences as another person. So you don't have to have gone through what the other person has gone through to have empathy for them. Instead, it's about taking the time and the effort to try to consider the other person's perspective and think about how they may be feeling at a given point in time about their situation. Now, it's important here to distinguish between empathy and sympathy as well. So while empathy is more of a detached emotion, so I can have empathy for someone without feeling sorry for them, whereas sympathy is more about, like I say, feeling sorry for that person, and which implies an emotional closeness there, as in I feel sorry for that person, which may mean I'm too involved in that situation, where the way I see empathy is that it can be a little bit more detached. You can have empathy for someone without feeling sorry for them. So that's a distinction I'd like to make first. So when this person asked me how much empathy should you have, obviously it's a hard question to answer because the situation will be different every time. But it's actually got me thinking that there is obviously no real answer, but also I think we might be asking the wrong question in that case. Because when the person was saying, how much empathy should I have, what they were really talking about was, maybe a team member was not performing or behaving badly or whatever it might be. What they were really asking was, how tolerant should I be of this situation? Should I give the person some leeway? Should I be tolerant? Should I be more patient? Or should I, performance manage them for not performing or something like that? And I think that's where the question was aiming at. So I think we should separate the two concepts, right? The first one we have here is empathy, the concept of empathy, taking time to think from the other person's perspective. Now, I think we should always have empathy. 100% of the time we should have empathy. But we don't want to get confused between empathy and holding people accountable. So you may have a team member who's not performing and maybe they've got some trouble at home. Maybe they come into work and they're really tired because they haven't slept well. All these sorts of things might be happening, very common, obviously, in today's world. And so the question is not, should you have empathy for that person? Because having empathy might be about, hey, you know what, that's really hard. That sounds really hard that your baby's not sleeping and you're not getting any sleep, right? So that's empathy. You're empathizing with that person. But then the other question is the accountability piece. So how much tolerance should you have for maybe a lack of performance or some poor behavior, given that you understand the context of that person, you've taken the time to have that empathy? So we have to separate these two discussions. And I think what it comes down to is what's at stake in the situation. So I think you can have empathy 100% of the time, but just because you have empathy does not mean you can't take action maybe enforce consequences and hold people accountable for their behaviour and performance. And I think the stakes matter here, and I think that's one of the key factors that really makes you decide, what sort of actions am I going to take off the back of this? So, for example, if you're in a situation where someone's poor performance is endangering a patient in a hospital, let's call it that, right? Let's think about that example. Now, that's quite serious because a patient's health is at risk and maybe their lives are at risk if something happens, if there's poor performance in that case. So in that situation, I think you can still have empathy for someone in terms of they're struggling and they're having a hard time of it. But the degree of accountability has to be held up. So you might have to give them a formal warning or have disciplinary action initiated in that case because it's quite serious. Whereas, in another situation, let's say, well, they made a mistake on a calculation and it got the report wrong and your boss got a bit annoyed, but no harm done. You had time to correct it. It was fine. There was no drastic consequences. With those sort of things, once again, I think you can have empathy and try to understand what the person's been going through and how their personal situation might be, for example. But you may just pull them aside and give them feedback. You might not have to go to a disciplinary action. You might just give them feedback on, hey, next time it'd be great if we did this a bit better, whatever that might be. So I think we need to separate these concepts, empathy versus performance management or accountability. Because when we mix them, we're sort of saying, if I'm going to have empathy for my team member, then I'm not going to hold them accountable. But if I'm not going to have empathy, then I can fire them, right? Now, it's very possible, I think, to have empathy for someone and performance manage them out of your organization. Because it might just be that they're not a good fit, they don't have the right skills or knowledge or capability, maybe their personal circumstances make it impossible for them to do their job adequately, and it's damaging morale in the rest of the team. So there's certain situations where I think you can have empathy, but you still have to reinforce consequences and carry out whatever action is required in the situation. And yeah, like I say, I think it all comes down to the stakes. What is at stake in the situation? I think that's one of the key factors here. Because think of a situation where, let's imagine where we say, you know what, I'm going to have no empathy for this person. So they've made a mistake, maybe they're performing badly, and you've just made zero effort to try to think of where they're coming from or, what they might be going through at a given time. Just consider what sort of leader that would make you seem like. And as a thoughtful leader listening to this podcast, I think it's unlikely that you would take this approach. But just consider for a minute, a 0% empathy approach would really be, I don't care what is happening with you. You have underperformed and you're going to face the consequences. Now, an empathic approach, on the other hand, might be, hey, tell me what's going on here. Because we've seen that your performance hasn't been great lately. This issue happened. I'd like to discuss it with you, but I'd like to get your side of the story first. What's happening for you? How are you feeling at the moment? Your performance hasn't been what it was normally. And then you can get their side of the story. You might hear some things that you don't expect, things that you weren't aware of, for example. And then you can say, hey, look, I appreciate you're in a tough situation at the moment. You've been having trouble at home or whatever it might be. But I will, if this continues to happen, we're going to have an issue and we'll need to, I'll need to give you a formal warning. So you can still have these sort of conversations and carry out consequences or enforce consequences and be empathic at the same time or empathetic at the same time. So yeah, I don't think there's not a clear answer how empathetic should I be, but I think the answer really is, well, you can always have empathy, but don't let the empathy stop you from enforcing consequences. And I think if we do that, we have fallen potentially into the trap of sympathy, which is I feel sorry for this person's situation and therefore I'm going to be nice to them and lenient because I feel mean if I, give them a formal warning or whatever it might look like. So I'm interested in your take on this one as well. What do you think? How much empathy should you have? And are they separate concepts like I'm talking about, empathy and consequences? Can you have both? What do you reckon? Leave me a comment on the show notes page, thoughtfulleader.com/podcast/329. I'd love to hear what you think. And obviously, if you are going through challenging situations like this, where you're trying to determine, what's the course of action should I take? Those are great things that I work with people on during coaching. So if you think coaching might be helpful for you, then get in touch. You can look on that show notes page. There'll be a link to my coaching page and you can book in a call and we can have a chat and see whether it's right for you. So thank you for listening to this episode. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think about this empathy topic. And I will be back next week.